I'm Shaheen Townsend with the Journalism Society. This is Abraham Cisne. Glad to be talking to you in New York City. You were just going to go to Mexico for fun or for work?
That was a personal trip that we were planning, so I was gonna go for a friend's birthday.
But you've gone to Mexico before for work, right?
Many times, yeah. I've worked in several states in Mexico, or been there for work-related events, so yeah.
In like Jalisco or where
Yeah,
have you
I've
been?
actually been to Jalisco, Guadalajara. I've been to many states. Guanajuato, Mexico City multiple times. Some of the touristy areas by Quintana Roo or Yucatan, those areas.
What is your job? What was your job in Mexico? What were you doing?
So we're talking about multiple trips, different, they were all different experiences, and some it was, a lot of them were more focused at that time in the youth programs that I used to work on that were more focused on youth development, providing youth with training so that they had better outcomes in life, so that they maybe performed better at school or got employment or got out of poverty or that kind of thing. So those were the types of programs, or just leadership programs so that they could change their own communities as well.
What years were this?
So pretty much all through the 2010s, teens, yeah.
And this was through the U.S. State Department?
It might have been a combination. I definitely worked with U.S. State Department funded programming. I worked with USAID funded programming, and I worked with other source U.S. government and non-U.S. government funded programs as well. And so with Mexico, it's a mishmash of some of those, or just one or the other.
How would you describe your line of work? Right now, I know that you work for a New York City law firm, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I work for nonprofits. In the past, I worked more for international focused nonprofits that sought to have an international impact, that focused on international aid, international assistance, economic development, agricultural development, youth development, that sort of thing. So most of my career was international focused in that sense, and most of it was funded by U.S. government funding. But I also, now I work with more domestic or even New York City focused nonprofits.
Where's your firm located in New York City? I'm just curious.
They have offices in all 5 boroughs since they provide legal services. And the headquarters is in Tribeca in Manhattan. Yeah.
So when you did most of your work in Central America, what was the name of the organization? Or was it multiple organizations that you worked for?
So most of the time I worked with an organization called Partners of the Americas, based in Washington, D.C. I don't work with them any longer. But I didn't only work in Central America. I worked in the Caribbean, across the Caribbean, Central America, to a lesser extent actually, and mostly South America and the Caribbean, and then also a little bit in North Africa.
You're Nicaraguan.
Yes.
Right.
By origin, yes.
I'm part Nicaraguan as well.
Right.
Have you done any work in Nicaragua?
No, unfortunately, actually, that's a sensitive issue because the government there doesn't really welcome U.S. foreign funding programs. And in those programs, we were always pretty transparent about what we were doing in a given country, and oftentimes those projects didn't even exist without collaboration between the two governments from the very beginning.
That's just not possible.
With Nicaragua, no, they're very much not friendly with U.S. government-funded activities in the country, and they've only gotten more stricter and repressive in the last like 20 years.
Yeah, I've been to Managua. I went to Managua 2 years ago.
Sure.
That was pretty cool. I liked it a lot.
It's a great country. Not to just focus on negative things about Nicaragua, but it's a great place. I encourage people to go as long as it's safe at the time. And yeah, I've been all over that country, so not just Managua for sure.
These other organizations that you've worked for in the past, early 2000s, let's say, was one of your goals to promote and spread democracy in Central and South America?
So very early on, no and yes, yes and no, right? Early on, I worked on more democracy-focused programming, especially when I was more entry level.
What does that mean?
So when I first started, basically fresh out of college, the first projects that I worked on, democracy focused.
I mean, aren't these countries mostly democratic republics?
Yes, but they all aspire to be better, just like the United States is also, or, there's different types of democracies, first of all. In the EU, they're different, they're parliamentary, and everybody's maybe at a different level, right? There is a measure, there are organizations, international bodies out there that measure where democracies are, and they're all over in a spectrum, right? So none of them are perfect, and they're all looking for ways to improve. But what we did at that time were we worked with US government funding, and we partnered with countries, and we were very transparent about where we were. And we often, sometimes those countries welcomed it because it was more funding to give you an example of what that work actually looks like. Every country has a couple or multiple principal political parties in the country that are organized, that have been there for years, decades, if not longer. Some of them are like, yeah, we're happy to welcome your funding, and we have to use it for certain things, like how to engage women better in your political party, how to engage indigenous people in your political party, how do you reach out to different minorities, because every country has different types of minorities. It's not just the United States.
Right.
So those are the types of programming that we did, and those parties win because if they didn't want to participate, they didn't have to, right? But we would have those kind of training sessions for them, and I would support those programs in very kind of entry-level ways. But later I worked on other programming as well when I was more advanced in my career. There were secondary democratic impacts, right? A lot of they were more diplomatic focused, like, look, the United States is friendly. Let's be friends, basically. We're doing this because we're decent people. You are too. Let's work together, right? Let's do something for youth and bring youth over to the United States. Maybe it's the only international trip they've ever had in their lives. And we would select in those programs, oftentimes grade students in their schools, local leaders, youth leaders, and we would bring them to the US and vice versa, take US youth from around the United States, places like, I've also worked in Kansas, I've worked in Oregon,
So
worked
it's not
in
just Latin
Tennessee,
Americans,
right? I worked
okay.
across the Americas. But most of my work was focused on Latin America, and most of the people that I worked with, most of the teams that I worked with, were based in the Caribbean, South America, a little bit in Northwest Africa, and some in Central America too.
From what I know, you've also been to Venezuela.
Yes.
Right? And in the past couple months, we've not had the best relations with Venezuela. I mean, we did just arrest their president,
Sure.
Maduro.
Sure.
What was your work in Venezuela? Were you in Caracas?
Yes, I've been to several places in Venezuela, not just Caracas. Caracas, Maracaibo, Cumaná, many different places in the country. All the major cities are Maracaibo and Caracas. They're massive cities. I'm sure they're bigger than
Like
Wilmington.
millions of people?
They're both much, much larger than Wilmington, North Carolina, for example.
Well, yeah.
We're talking about they're comparable to the New York or maybe even a little smaller. Those are massive cities with subways and universities and entire, very diverse communities and very dynamic communities, I should say. But I went to other places as well, kind of like secondary cities and a little bit in the countryside. Most of the work I did in Venezuela was, I did two really specific areas of work. I work with youth on youth development initiatives, helping youth leaders become better leaders in their communities, whether through volunteer projects, whether through campus projects, whether through some other type of project that they wanted to start, even small businesses. But I also worked with Venezuela on agricultural and economic development projects. We helped farmers, like just farmers out there, produce better quality and more food so that the population would have more protein and a more nutritious diet.
Does
So I
that
did
mean
those
you
kind of
were-
projects too.
You were like adjusting the soil, or you were giving them more equipment?
Yeah, we gave supplies, we gave equipment, we gave seeds, because seeds, a lot of people don't realize. I had to learn a lot about agriculture too because I didn't study it,
Right.
but I worked with the experts. I worked with agronomists, I worked with PhDs in those fields. And so seed quality can degrade over time. You can't just use the same seed, right?
Yeah.
You got to get a better quality seed to produce something. And then things like if you bring a product, an agricultural product from another country, you have to adapt it to your soil and your climate, which is very varied, by the way, in Venezuela. And so there's a whole cycle and steps, and you need technical know-how. But we didn't just bring a bunch of stuff from outside of the country. We worked mostly with what was already there and just helped some of the lower income kind of small, medium-sized producers, still pretty big producers, but produce better products that maybe they couldn't buy because Venezuela has gone through really hard economic times in the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah.
And so,
And when you were in Caracas and those other cities you mentioned in Venezuela, could you feel I wouldn't want to say difference because I don't know if you've been to Venezuela before Maduro, but
yeah.
could you feel like that there was an effect socialism had on the country?
Yeah,
Could you feel the policies implemented?
Sure, absolutely. But you don't just get that. You also get, unfortunately, the truth about them, that government, is that they did try to create socialist type programs, some of them more or less effective, but they also became authoritarian. Keep in mind, Chavez was in power for 14 years.
Yeah.
Unimaginable in the United States. And that was just Chavez, right? Now Maduro is the one who followed him. So you saw that, but you also saw like an authoritarian slant, right? I remember when I went, to give you an example, when I went...
Like a police state?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You see that too. And so literally they had Chavez's eyes. I probably have a photo somewhere in like Facebook or something. They just took this, like a photo from a stock photo of Chavez, and they put it everywhere. Basically, they're watching you, right? Like basically he's still there, but just his eyes. What does that imply, right? Like not his whole body, but just his eyes. And so you see both of those things. But
Would you say that prevented crime in Venezuela?
No, it skyrocketed. It hit the worst. They went through their worst crime spree during this time period.
Right.
They weren't great before, but it got worse and worse. And that's what led to the mass migration, was how unsafe people were.
Right,
and the
diaspora.
economic downturn,
Yeah.
which happened on several different stages, right? It wasn't just like one big economic shock.
We know about the Venezuelan diaspora because there are hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan immigrants all throughout Central America trying to
South America as
get
well.
through the Darien Gap, right?
As well, yeah.
And go all the way to the United States, I'm presuming.
Yeah. And not just to the U.S. You have a big emigre population from Venezuela and Peru, in Brazil, in Spain,
Costa Rica as well.
in Costa Rica, everywhere. So
Right.
it's not just, they didn't all just try to come north through the Darien Gap, which is extremely dangerous. And when people migrate from a country, there's all different socioeconomic levels leaving the country, from wealthy people to the poorest of the poor, and everybody has a different route, a different outcome, a different way of traveling to somewhere else.
You told me, we spoke in Costa Rica a couple months ago.
Sure.
And we had a conversation about Venezuela. You told me that some of the ultra wealthy, or like the very rich in Venezuela at least, stayed in Venezuela. Some did.
Yeah.
And they still kept their properties, they still kept their homes.
I worked around these folks, yeah.
And this is just out of curiosity. Do they operate in Venezuelan currency or do they use U.S. currency?
No, this happens pretty much in every country. This happened in Cuba. This happens in a lot of places where the economy collapses and their local currency devalues. Not just Venezuela, but yeah, so dollars were everywhere. Right. And in fact, we had to oftentimes create budgets for our projects. This is something I oversaw, when I became a manager on these projects and higher up. The budgets were done in dollars because it's just like, why we're not even going to try to convert, because everybody's just using dollars at this point.
Some people thought that when Maduro was captured, China would lose a major part of their oil imports. Did you feel like the Chinese yuan had any power in Venezuela?
What I can say is, just from my personal experience, we
dollar
never
had power.
interacted with that currency.
I got you.
Everywhere, and I worked, like I said, across the country. I saw no signs of their influence. Plenty of countries have influence in Venezuela. The Russians have influence in Venezuela. Iranians have influence in Venezuela. They were there. They built some of the socialist projects that we saw. I remember seeing like a housing community, and they were like, "That's Iranian built."
Wow.
So there's a lot of countries who were involved. Again, diplomacy. We were speaking about this earlier. Everybody does diplomacy. Every country in history, especially the wealthier ones, have diplomacy programs. They do too, those countries that I just listed. And that was part of what they did with Venezuela.
In the past 10, 20 years, when Venezuela was on that gradual decline with high crime rates, a police state, but probably very easy to corrupt, would you say that cartel activity influenced day-to-day life in Venezuela?
I'm sure there was an influence. I wouldn't say it was day-to-day life, no. I mean, This is how I view things. After spending so much time in Latin America, again, years and years of working in the region, living in the region as an adult, as working and living in the region too. I lived and worked in Costa Rica for a while. In all those experiences, the cartels, narcos, don't even perceive them because the vast majority of people have nothing to do with them, right? I know in the United States, we often have that perception here, but a lot of it is because we're just biased from the media that we consume. We watch maybe too much Netflix and we think narcos is like everything, right? That's not the case. And most of the time what I saw were, just everyday people. I'm sure the narco trade in South America impacted and was involvement from the Maduro government, maybe even the Chavez government. I can't really speak to that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was. But in terms of how it impacted everyday people and everybody I worked with, which was a lot of people in all these countries, you don't really see it very much. Those things are kept in the wraps and they're kind of marginal, and there's a few players making a lot of money, and it's not the majority of people by any means.
So you would say that the cartel didn't influence or affect your work diplomatically or aid-wise?
Only if it was a security issue.
Right.
Sure.
Did that ever happen?
But yeah, absolutely. I worked in areas that were insecure.
In Colombia?
And so in Colombia and Venezuela, I went during one of the most unstable periods and highest crime period. So yeah, we actually had to hire like security teams for this organization because you can't just have staff in another country and not be concerned about their well-being.
Right.
And so we had a team that could help extract us if we needed it, like in case of an emergency, not just because of crime, but that was a real risk because there was, kidnapping. There was a phenomenon, and there might still be, called express kidnapping. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before. Express kidnapping is when somebody kidnaps you in a car and they just kidnap you for an hour, but they, maybe hold you at gunpoint and say, empty your ATM, or let's go to an ATM and empty your accounts, right? That was that's a thing that's happened in many other countries. But it also happened in Venezuela very much for a time. We had to make sure all staff are safe, including the local staff. Most of the staff we worked on these projects were local people, not just people from the US. They're the ones who know their communities best. If you're going to have community impact somewhere, or you're going to have an economic impact in a community, you want to have the locals on your side, because they're the ones who know how to speak the language, they know the context, they know how to make things work in the country. What's famous in Colombia, well, they start to overlap, is paramilitary and guerrilla groups. Paramilitaries tend to be more right-wing, right? And they were often times have ties with more wealthy landowners, and they repressed lower-income people. And the guerrilla groups, what they call guerrilla, when you hear that, it tends to be
Sandinista.
Referring to, but in Colombia, they're not called Sandinista. They're left-wing groups like, I believe, the ELN, what's the other big one that, the FARC, for example, are the most famous ones. I was working in the country when their civil war, they have the longest civil war in the Western Hemisphere. It's over 50 years, and it ended, when was this? 2010s, around there. And I was working a lot with the country when that was happening. And I worked on kind of peace-building projects as well.
You were kind of entering their territory or something?
Right, exactly. So I worked in some of these very rural areas. In this program, I worked with a lot of young entrepreneurs, but in rural areas, from rural and agricultural backgrounds. A lot of them grew up on farms in Colombia, and they were from all over the country. And so I had to go to these sites. Embassy staff wouldn't go, they had to get special permission to go.
Did you ever have to carry a weapon?
No, but sometimes we did have bodyguards in some of the places I went to, including places like Mexico.
Speaking of Mexico, did you provide help or security to one of the Mexican presidents?
I worked with a former Mexican president, Vicente Fox, and it was a youth sports program. I was there to go to like a convention or a conference that we had that was all about social impact in Mexican communities. And Vicente Fox is he was a big philanthropist. He might still be. He was actually the one of the few examples where I worked with private funding on social impact programming, and it wasn't even from the US, it was from within Mexico. Yeah, he was a great guy to me, at least, yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily agree or stand by his politics, because I don't even know enough, honestly. I know a little bit, because I remember when he was president.
In your experience, how does organized crime, like the cartel, most commonly distort local governance and humanitarian aid or development? Does it cause corruption?
Yeah, corruption is probably the biggest example when you have so much money and pressure and risk. If you were concerned and if you're in an isolated region and these people with a lot of guns and money are there, they're probably going to start to buy people out. What I really saw was the risk, right? Like when we saw that a place was so risky, so I had coworkers that worked on other communities and sometimes I would get involved a little bit. So I overlapped, to give you an example, with a project that was focused on sports, specifically soccer, for development in a place like Honduras. And at the time, Honduras probably had the highest or one of the highest murder rates in the world. And we worked in that community. But even in that community, we had to be very careful about what we were doing. We didn't want to put the youth at risk. We didn't want to put the local staff at risk, who are the majority of the people working on the project. And when we traveled there, obviously we had to be careful. So what we did, since we worked with so much locals, if they were like, hey, right now it's not safe, there's a big crime spree, there's kidnappings happening in the community, then we just couldn't visit, right?
Right.
So that's kind of my experience with some of these local organized crime. We generally just try to avoid them, and that's how they affected programming too. Meaning maybe we couldn't expand the programming as much, or we had to work around them, or we had to avoid places because of them. So that's the impact they have. It's so unsafe that you can't do stuff in some of these places. It's too risky. Worst part is when they take it out on the youth we work on.
Really? Wow.
Right? Or they
Has
do
that ever
something.
happened?
They were, if I recall correctly, there were threats made for sure. Absolutely.
Youth like 12 years old or 18?
No, we worked mostly with like teenage, but yeah, sure, there was probably youth around that age, right? Like, but I'm talking about the beneficiaries of our projects, but not the organized crime actors. I don't know how old they were, but they definitely have gotten threats in some of the places where we've worked, and we've had to, like I said, avoid the situation and probably even move some activities at times.
I want to talk to you a little bit about this current U.S. administration.
Sure.
They kind of wiped out a lot of programs. They said it was to purge government spending. How did Trump's Doge program affect U.S. aid?
If I'm not mistaken, they shuttered USAID. They closed it altogether. My estimate, just from hearing people who still work in the field and from my recent experiences, they canceled funding for probably over 90% of the activities, because their position is that these international funded programs, social impact programs, health economic programs, whatever they are, they're not worth it, right? I believe they are. Ignorance and intolerance of programs or people or whatever they are, they go hand in hand. If they see that the U.S. is a helpful partner as opposed to a violent one, then that could help us. That makes it safer if we travel there, just to give you a basic example.
What has made you the most proud in all the work that you've done throughout your career?
Most proud about is any impact that I've had in an organization. If I created a policy that will outlive the time that I spend working at that organization, I'm really proud of that, right? Maybe I helped create a generative AI policy at a former organization. I did do that, actually. And that stayed with them. And it'll probably be improved, right? And so it sounds basic, it sounds boring, but I like having that kind of impact everywhere I go, leaving something, creating some manual, creating some policy, creating something so that these projects work better, so that they're more accountable, right? So that we know how things are, how money is being spent, so that we know how to make them safer, to make them more transparent. Because all these projects are kind of, theoretical until you implement them, and they have to be improved just like any other project, right? And so we learn lessons and invest the time to improve. And so any of those improvements, those are some of the things I'm proudest of. And then I really enjoyed working with young people and just having a real impact in people's lives. I worked heavily, most recently in the last 3 or 4 years, in Western Venezuela. I saw so many stories out there of people who never had protein, kids who didn't have protein. And when you're a child and you have an insufficient diet, your brain doesn't finish forming properly.
Wow.
And so we focused on making sure those little kids had enough protein, had a diverse and nutritious diet, And we heard stories from people who hadn't seen some basic common fruits or proteins in months and maybe longer. And so when we brought those kind of foods to the community and we didn't just bring it, we taught them how to, and we gave them the resources to grow it.
Yeah.
When kids have better nutrition, they have better outcomes in life. This is research backed. That means that they study better, they get better grades, in turn, they get better jobs, and they have better outcomes. They have higher incomes in life and less likely to be limited to poverty or impoverished conditions. And so that kind of work, I'm really proud of.
I got you. I understand. Yeah. Well, those are all the questions I have for you today.
Cool.
And I'm very glad for, being able to interview you, my second cousin, but you're basically like my uncle.
Yeah.
In New York City, the greatest city on earth.
Yeah.
And it was a pleasure talking to you this evening.
Yeah.
My name is Shaheen Townsend with the Journalism Society. This is Abraham Cisne. And thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.
It was nice talking to you.
Yeah, likewise.